Okay, let's go and get started today. And today what I want to do is, again, focus on not programming things particularly, but things for your project. And specifically today I want to focus on version control systems. And what a version control system is, we'll get into in a second, but this will help you with your project, especially if you're dealing with a team. You have multiple people working on the code base at one time. We'll talk about that in a second. But before I do that, keep in mind that today you should show up to the in-person lecture to go over your project proposal to present that. So make sure to be there today for class, 5 o'clock, normal classroom time. Okay, now, what is a version control system? And let me hide my face on here so you can actually see the entirety of what's said there. The version control systems are essentially a way they're designed to maintain source code and other project assets in a controlled manner. And what does that mean for you and your project? Why would you ever want to use that? Well, if you have a large team or a small team, it allows you to work on a shared code base with different people working on it at the same time. It ensures that changes don't overwrite each other, because if you try to make a change that overwrites somebody else's change, it'll force you to resolve that as you commit those changes. It'll also maintain a history of changes. So if you have something that was working before and is now broken, you can go back and look at the history of what the code did from where it used to be, where it is now. And it will also tell you who made each of the individual commits or each of those changes. It also allows you to add notes to those changes, and you can browse through those, like, why did this change happen? Oh, it's to fix this bug. Why did this change happen? Oh, it's to add this feature. So it allows you to add notes as you make those changes and make those commitments. It also allows developers to look at all changes made and then roll them back if necessary. So if you have a change that created a problem or a change that you decided was inappropriate, you can roll that back to a previous version and then start from there as if that change never happened, without having to remember each line of code that change affected. And it can be a real useful tool for maintaining that code. And even if you're not on a team, if it's just you by yourself, a version control system can be useful for all those same reasons. You can see what changes you made and when this code changed and what the previous version looked like. Where are the lines that are different between these? So it can be a really powerful tool for project development. Okay, now looking back at the version control systems that are available, there are quite a few that are out there. There's some that are fairly popular. I'll talk about those here. But there's this concurrent versions system, CVS, which is open source. It's server-based. There's also Subversion, also called SVN, which is also open source and server-based. There's Git, which is open source and distributed, so you don't necessarily need a server to use Git. There's Mercurial, which is open source, and then there's Microsoft SourceSafe, which is kind of a Microsoft product that allows version control systems. It's proprietary, not open source, but it's server-based. It's a centralized model. And then there's a Visual Studio Team Services, which is also a Microsoft-created proprietary SVN or versioning system that's distributed. So Microsoft has both this distributed one and a server-based one that you can use. The most common ones that I see used are open source, and those are SVN and Git. And Git is newer than SVN, but notice the difference here. This one is server-based, this one is distributed. Now, let's focus on SVN here for a second, so since that's one of the more commonly used centralized ones. And you'll notice with SVN, it is an open source, centralized, server-based version control system. And that means that the SVN is stored on a database that's stored on a server. So in other words, here's the in this picture, here's the SVN server. Here are the clients that are using it. This could be the different members of your team. They all access that repository, that server's database of code. but they also have a local copy that gets downloaded as well. We'll talk about that in a second. So in other words, they get a copy of the code, they make changes to it, and then they update the parts that need changed, which then contacts the server to maintain all the changes. If somebody new joins your team, they just need to check out that project. It includes all access to all of the changes and everything get downloaded here. They can then make changes and then commit those, which will update it on the repository. Now, one of the things that's worth noting over here, is to use SVN. That means you need two things. You need the server that's set up that has a repository on it. All repositories are often called a repo. And you can set up your own server on a system that's on your LAN, or you could set up your own server and put it on the internet. For a large team, there are also a lot of sites that will host your repositories for you. And we're going to look at a free one of those here in just a little bit today. You also then need SVN client software, which is software that works to check out the files from the repository and then commit changes back to the repository. That software would be installed on your client machine. And we're going to look at a common one of those that's freely available, that's easy to use as well. All right, so let's try it. So we're going to set up a repository on a server, and I'm going to use this free service called SVN.com that offers free SVN hosting. You basically just register and create a repository for your project. And then we're also going to download some client software. We're going to use Tortoisesvn. Once that's installed, you can connect a folder to the repository you created. So in other words, it's going to appear to you like just a normal folder in your normal operating system. But then all SVN interactions can happen through Windows directly. So you don't have to use any command line tools for SVN. If you use Tortoisesvn, you can still use command line tools if you want to do it that way. But Tortoise kind of integrates it all into the file explorer within Windows, and we'll take a look at that. All right, so let's start off. Actually, let's do this. Let's set one of these up. So let me go to SVN.com and get that process started. So let me do that real quick here. And let me switch this so you can see what I'm doing. All right, so here's SVN. I've already registered and already created repositories on here, but I'm going to show you this interface anyway. So here you'll notice when you sign up for this, you'll create a username, you'll set up your password, you'll have to provide an email address, and you'll have to confirm it, but it's all completely free. And so I'm just going to go ahead and log into this. So I log into that using my name and password. And what you'll notice is what I have is it gives you up to 5 repository slots that you can use and set up. So you could set up different repositories for your different thing. You can also, if you end up using this for projects, you can pay them, you can give them donations. And after you have your repository set up, notice I have one active repository here. Let me look at that. Oh, actually, that's up here in repositories. So I've got this one called Repo1 here. And if I click, once you set one up, there you would click on it, and there it is. So if you want to set up a, and this is the URL over here on the left that you used to get to that. So I'm going to go back to my dashboard again, and I'm going to create a new repository. Let me go to repositories, and let me say create new. So I'm going to give it a title. So this is what you would do to set one up. I'm going to call this like my game. Let's call it 1. And this is the name that's going to show up. So let me call this like ETGG1802 project. And over here, I'm going to give it a name. Now notice about the name. It says this is lowercase only and no white space. I'll keep it short and simple. So here I'm going to call this like game project 1. and then click Next Step. So that repository name has already been taken by someone else. So and these are, since these have to have a unique name, there might be other people. So you might want to put your initials here or something about the class. So I'm going to put like PWI Game Project 1. So that's my initials. And then we'll say Next Step. Okay, that one's available. So it says Create Repository from Scratch. We'll just say Next Step. And there it is. And so I can have this email notification, but I'm just going to confirm that. And now notice I have that other repository. And if I click on that one, it gives me the URL over here. So that's going to be important to us for connecting that to our project. So I'm going to leave this up for a second, and I want to go to a file explorer here. Let me go in here. Let me go up to the actual stuff for this project or this class. And what I'm going to do is, let's say this is where you're storing your files, and this is inside of my place where I'm storing the stuff for the class. But here, I'll go into online lectures, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder here. So right click, I'm going to say New Folder. I'm going to call this like Game Project. And I'll give it the ETGG1802 Game Project. Now we need to connect that to that repository. And here's the repository name over here. Here's the folder we want to connect to that. Now after you install Tortoisesvn, let me go and bring up the installer for that. So if you go to Tortoisesvn to install that, you go to Downloads. If you have a 64-bit machine, you can download version 1.14.1 or a 32-bit one. There's two of those. But after you install that, what that's going to do is that's going to integrate SVN with Windows in a very direct way. So let's go back over here and let me show you what I'm talking about when I mean that. So now notice that there's the URL. Here's this folder we created. If I right-click on that now, you'll get this Tortoisesvn thing here. And you'll also notice you can do an SVN checkout on that. So if I do SVN checkout, that's going to ask me for the URL of the repository. So to put in the URL of the repository, I'm just going to copy this, Control-C that, come back over here to Tortoisesvn, to that window, and I'm going to paste that in there. And notice it has the checkout directory here as the directory we just, the folder we just linked to there. And then we're just going to say OK. Okay, it's asking for my username and password for that. I don't remember what my password is for that site. Let me figure that out real quick. But you would put your username and password in there. Let me see if I can find that here. Hold on one second. I'm going to see if I can find what my password is for that. Okay, so I think I know what my password is now, thanks to Google. And now notice it's checking that out. It says it's checked out at revision level 0. That means no revisions have been made yet. And so now that that's checked out, I just say OK. And now you'll notice something interesting has happened in the Windows Explorer. Notice there's a green check mark by that. So what that's done is that's checked out the working copy, which is currently empty. So now if I go into this and I right click, and let's make a new file. Let's say new text document, and I'll call this like make a design document.text. If I want to add this to the SVN, I can right click, and then under Tortoisesvn, I can click add. And that will now add that to that repository I created as something it's in. And now notice the green check has turned to a red exclamation mark, showing that my local copy is out of sync with the repository that I've created. And so now if I right click this again and say SVN commit, SVN commit is updating the actual stuff that's stored in the project, so I can commit that. I can provide notes, added design document. To say what it is that I'm committing, I say OK. It connects to the server, it commits it, and now notice it has also incremented the revision level. So now inside of my project, if I go in there, that design document has a green check saying that it's up to date as well. And now the cool thing about this is now I could edit this document if I want to. So I'll just say edit. And I'll say to do, create prototype 1. And the cool thing about this is this does not just work with text files like this. It also work with all your source code. So if you have Python code in here, you can add those to the repository. If you have assets like graphics and things like that, you can add them here. So let's say there's a to-do list here. Step 1, create prototype 1. Step 2, test prototype. And so forth. You can make whatever you want here. Do a Control S to save that. And now you'll notice when I've saved that, notice that now has a red exclamation mark. This has not been committed. It's been changed in the local copy, but not changed in the on the server. And if I go up a directory, this folder knows that it hasn't been committed. So I can just do a SVN commit. I could provide notes, updated to-do list. And I can say OK. And that will commit that and upload it to the server. And now my revision level is at 2. Now, one of the cool things that I can do with this is, let's edit this one more time. So I'm going to bring that up and edit it and say, let's add a thing in here and say 1.5. We want to create assets for the prototype. Let me do a Control S to save that and get out of that. And now you'll notice that we have the design document. We could either commit that by itself. So SVN commit. Put our change notes in there, say OK. That commits it. But here's one, and now we're at revision 3. So we say OK. So now on this, one of the cool things you can do is notice if you go down here to this context menu, it says SVN, Tortoisesvn. I can click on that, and then I can say diff with previous version. And so if you want to, or you could say, you could actually diff that with multiple previous versions. You can also look at the revision history for this thing. So update to a certain revision. You can look at the revision history and see what's changed. But one of the things that I find useful is diff with previous version. And so if you click that, then you'll notice what happens is we get this other program. And this other program, which is WinMerge in this case, which is installed, it'll show you what has changed between revision 2 and the working copy, which is the one we have right now. So this was the previous version. And this is where it is now. And it'll highlight the lines that have changed. So the things that have changed is this 1.5 has been added in there. And over here, it'll show you like an overview of what lines have changed. And this can be really useful when you have complicated code bases that you're making changes to. Because you can say, well, what did I change in this most recent version? What changed in this particular version? And in fact, you can, if you want to, you can diff with other versions as well. The repository will keep track of all of the changes and how it's changed from a previous version, and you can search through that. But this can be a really useful way. If you want to revert to a previous version, you could right-click this and under Tortoisesvn, you could say update, where Tortoisesvn, you can say update to revision, and you can provide the revision number here. You can do show log. It'll show you, it'll connect to that server, and it will show you all of the revisions. And here are the messages we added for what has changed. And I could pick which revision I want. And I could click on that and update to that one. I'm going to leave it as it is for right now. But no, you could. That's how you would roll back to other previous versions. So very useful tool for sharing projects and working on code. You can also see, you'll notice that if I look at this, I can go to Tortoisesvn and I can look at the show log for that particular file. And notice it shows who the author was and who made those revisions and what time and date they made those revisions. So it keeps track of all of that. So revision 1, it was added, and then it was changed, and then it was changed again to the current one that it is now. So this can be a really useful tool. The Tortoisesvn makes it really simple to interact with that without having to use command line tools, and you can see the status of that in here. Now, to show you a little bit more of how useful this thing is, I'm going to switch over to something that's a much larger repo. This is the one that my company uses, so I'm going to go into some stuff that I know has some changes in it. Oh, and the SVN, my internet is down right now, so I guess I can't actually access these. But notice that, here, let me go into one of these. Unfortunately, my internet is, my local internet to access this is down right now. But normally I'd be able to go into here and right click on one of these, and under Tortoisesvn, I could say diff with some previous version, but since my LAN connection is down, I'm connected. Since the internet is down, I'm connected to a mobile hotspot, which cannot get to my company SVN. So unfortunately, that didn't work. I was going to show you how useful it was when you had, and there it is, complaining about the network being down. But normally you would have a really large project like that. All of the files would show which ones have changed, which ones haven't, which ones have been committed, which ones haven't. You could click on any one of those files or any one of those revision histories, see all the files that have changed, and then diff that file with the previous one and see what exactly has changed. And that can be really useful. Something gets added that creates a bug. Where did that bug come from? What file and what parts of that were changed in there? And like I said, that can be really useful for that. Now, one other thing is, how do you add additional users to your project? Notice there's this edit team over here, where you can add users into that, add new user. To add a new user, you'll just fill in the username you want. When you, if they are registered on ReuSVN, you'll be able to add them to your project. So everybody would have to register. You would add their username to the database, and then they could access this as well, and it would show their name when they make changes to that. And to access your repository, they would use their username and their password, and if you've added them to that repository, then they'll be able to access it and check it out, make changes, make submissions, and so forth. Okay, so heading back to the presentation. Oops, the presentation quickly. And let me go back for a second. SVN Terminology, I don't think we spent time on this like we should have. So I want to go through this since we went through that. A repo is the repository. That's where the database that stores all the projects and changes that lives on a server. That was the thing we provided that URL to Tortoise to connect to that. Note that ReuSVN, it's free. It allows you to set up more than one repository. So you can have more than one project, where you can divide your project into several repositories. One that's the repository for, I don't know, like assets, one that's for documentation, and one for the actual game code. Or I like to just put them all in one folder into one repository and just make subfolders underneath that. And notice that's totally fine to do. Just like we created that folder, you can make subfolders in there and add those to the repository. You can do that however much you want. The trunk is kind of a file directory where all the main development files are stored. That would be like the base folder that we talked about or we showed in that example. A branch is a point where development can be forked into multiple paths. You can actually have SVN handle that. So if you're making a game and you decide, I want to make 2 versions of this, one that is the multiplayer one that's the desktop, or one that's the Steam version, one that's the mobile version. So you could create a branch and then fork that into 2 different development paths from that point on. A tag is a named snapshot of the development at some point in time. Tags are really useful for you release, for example, an alpha version of the prototype, and you want to make that a point you can always go back to. So you can make a tag at that point in time, and then you could always go back to that. Or maybe a major version release, version 1, make a tag for that. Version 2, make a release for that. Version 2.3, make a release for that, or make a tag for that. And that allows you to always then revert back to that point in time and look at what did version 1 look like, rather than having it get lost to history. So you could always re-roll back to those other versions in the code and see what the source code looked like at that point in time. Also, checkout is the name of copying the files from the server to your local directory or working copy. Update means pull changes that have been made to the repository into your working copy. So if somebody else has made changes to the repository and you want to update it, notice that's a little bit different than checkout. Checkout is kind of copying the files, all of the directory, and putting it on your local copy. Update is only pulling the things that have changed into your working copy. And then commit is basically what we did there, where you say, I've made changes to a file, or want to add a new file. That's pushing those up to the server, that server copy. Okay, one other thing that I would suggest doing is learning how to use Git. Git is also a popular distributed version control system. It can be used locally or with server-stored repository. It can work either way since it's distributed. There is a popular site just like that Ryu SVN that you can use to host Git repositories called GitHub. A lot of you may have downloaded somebody's code from that or projects from that or heard that referenced. But GitHub is just a popular site that hosts Git repositories, and you can use that for hosting yours as well. So a few links if you're interested in using Git instead of using SVN that I showed in this class. GitHub.com, you can go there. There's also this tutorial for beginner link that I posted here. And then there's this other thing here that shows how to use Git and how to do stuff with it. So what I would, so this is a thing walking somebody through how to set up Git, a Git repository and how to use that. So I'd suggest going ahead and looking at these and using those if you want to. I was going to keep things short. Here's how to install Git on Windows. This tells you how to use Git on Windows rather than just setting up the repository. So if you want to do that, feel free to go through and do that. Is what this last thing is. And that is all I was going to cover today. Pretty short, about a half-hour lecture. So go ahead and I would suggest you set up an SVN for your final project. Have everybody in your team select usernames on there, and then add everybody to that. So I'd have one of you set up the repository. Everybody else then can add usernames and then be added to that, and then check that out. And then you can start doing that. And then inside of there, rather than having a free-for-all, I would divide that up into separate subfolders with the assets, with the documentation, with the source code. And if you want, you can make the source code for your initial prototype in one directory. And then as you get to the point where you want to make more of a release candidate or a prototype version 2, make another folder, add that to the repository, edit the stuff as needed. You can totally do whatever you want in there. You can store any kind of files you want in that SVN, and it will track the changes that are made there. And then you can visualize those changes by using a tool like SVN and then going to say diff with previous versions. And you can see all the changes that have been made. All right, so that's it for today. Everybody stay safe, and I will hopefully see you in class tonight where you tell me what your projects are going to be and present those to the class. So see everybody soon.